Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm so thrilled to be here today with Umbrex member Paul Millard, who is the author of the breakaway self-published hit, The Pathless Path, Imagining a New Story for Work and Life, which has sold, Paul can confirm, more than 50,000 copies, I think. And also with the new book that just came out, Good Work, Reclaiming Your Inner Ambition. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Will. It's good to be back.
Yeah, and in terms of being back, we were just chatting before I hit record how you've been on the show several times. The first time was before the Pathless Path. At that point, you had Strategy U, your online strategy course on consulting skills. And then I think we did an episode after the Pathless Path came out, when it had just come out. And it sold. I think it surprised everyone, maybe even including yourself. Tell us,
Yes,
before we get
definitely.
into the good work, tell us just a little bit about sort of how the Pathless Path is played out. And it's unusual for a self-published book to get so much attention. Tell us a little bit about the story of the Pathless Path.
Yeah, so this second book is sort of the story of the Pathless Path, and it explains sort of what was happening behind the scenes for many years before that book happened. Um, it was definitely a surprise for me, basically because I'd never done anything like a book, but it was also not completely a surprise. And I say that in the sense of I had been writing for years about these topics and knew how powerful they were and how like the reactions people were giving me for years were always sort of blew me away. And it just really kept my curiosity going for years. So in our first conversation, we talked about a consulting skills course I was running. I only built that after I had one, fallen in love with a woman who I now am married to and have a child with, and two, had fallen in love with writing. So I was in Taipei about 6 years ago and just found myself waking up and writing every morning. And I loved it so much that I was just like, I'm going to build my life around this feeling and doing this kind of work. And so I was able to write for fun, following my curiosity for years. And that course was just one way of many things over the years that I've used to sort of fund that journey. And it's basically still sort of the model I have till today. And then when I put the Pathless Path out, I just was still excited about those ideas, still kept writing about work and our relationship to it for the last 3 years since that book's been out. And I think it just has continued to resonate with people. People started sharing it over time. I stayed engaged with it. It wasn't like one big launch and then I disappeared like many authors do. I just kept talking about it. And it still sort of blows me away. I received 2 messages yesterday from people that found it. I don't even know how people are finding it anymore. And they say it changed their life, which is, I mean, it's wild. Like, I just feel so lucky that I happen to be the vessel for that creation.
Okay. So for listeners who have not read that book, I mean, part of the whole idea, it's a little paradoxical because part of the idea of the book is not to reduce things
Right.
to a how-to or a recipe, but give us sort of a capsule concept of what the Pathless Path concept. It's about getting away from your scripts about work that you've maybe inherited from the culture, but give us an encapsulated view of the message of that book.
Yeah. So the book was my attempt to write a new story for myself after leaving what I called the default path. And it's in the subtitle of the book, Imagining a New Story for Work and Life. I, like you, worked in strategy consulting for many years. When I left that path, I became a freelancer, but the way people treated me and the way I felt was so different than being employed full time. It was almost as if to some people I had done something wrong. And also myself, like I sort of felt like I was wasting my talent or something. And especially in the sense when I started to deepen into doing something like writing, which is not a really good way to make a lot of money in a short period of time. And so I needed like a new story to make sense of what I felt and also name some of the possibilities that were emerging. And so really it's not a how-to book. It's sort of like a friendly companion or guide for people already on paths like this, right? Like you were actually one of the first people I called before I quit my job because I didn't really know anyone doing these things and that seemed to be thriving. And I think you were this person for people in 2016, 2017, 2015. I remember you would just talk to anyone who was taking the leap because there weren't like guides ahead of people. Like nobody knew what they were doing. It still seemed pretty crazy at the time to do these things. So I really wrote that book for my former self and saying, hey, if you are going to venture onto your own, here are some mental models, frameworks, inspirational stories that might help along the way. And hey, I also felt weird and didn't really feel like I was succeeding for the first couple of years.
That's so interesting. That's interesting that you got that, feedback, or that you had this sense that it was like something less than. When I became an independent consultant in 2008, I actually felt like pretty great about it. And
Did you make more money immediately than your previous?
yes, I did.
See, so this was the interesting thing for me. I made less and chose to make less because I liked the like freedom to work on things like writing
Yeah.
and also honestly I needed time to sort of like get to know myself and become more emotionally aware of what I actually wanted, what I desired, what enabled me to live a good life. And so I think a lot of the tension came from that money script of like, okay, the income goes up, 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 up.
Yeah.
And then boom, I brought it down. And then I kept it down on purpose. And so I sort of felt like, and some people said this to me, like, aren't you wasting all your experience?
Uh, that's interesting. Well,
And so it was really hard for me
huh.
because in the moment of what I was working on, I loved it and I felt so motivated. And I think other people on similar paths could see that and were like, wow, this is awesome. Keep going. We're rooting for you. Um, but I didn't feel that coherence with any broader cultural narrative or anything.
Hmm. Well, I don't know if I mentioned it to you, but I had a previous, right, after the Navy. So when I left the
The
Navy,
sabbatical.
yeah, I had basically 3 to 4 year kind of sabbatical, right? Where after I left the Navy in '97, I still was in the reserve. So, I mean, like a week and a month or something. But yeah, I took like basically 3, 4 years off, built a barn with my dad and uh, read a ton of books. So, so when I became an independent consultant, it was like much more socially acceptable than that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think these experiences, and this is sort of what I try to get at in both of my books, is that you can do these things. You don't have to work continuously your entire life. And in fact, by taking a step backward or a pause, you might actually be able to be more ambitious over the long term. And I think that's what I'm finding now is I feel very in command of my life. I have a good vision for like what I want to do, what I want to work on, and I feel good about it too. There's no like I'm not sacrificing to do work I don't enjoy for some paycheck or some script I'm following out. It's like, oh, I'm actually choosing these things and it feels good.
Let's turn to good work. Subtitle is Reclaiming Your Inner Ambition. Let's start with the definition. How do you define good work?
Yeah, so my definition is around connection. It's sort of a feeling you have. Good work is the things you're called to do, the things you must do, the things that when you stop them, they sort of call you back. You have to come back to them. They're sort of a place to connect with yourself, connect with the work, and connect with something deeper. And so I guess like my first book, I'm not clearly defining these things, but I think when people hear these things, they can think of something, right? And so for me, it's really the creation mode. that often means writing, but it takes other forms like this. Like conversations like this are loosely in my good work sometimes. Like they feel good, they light me up, they inspire me to think in new ideas. And at the end of them, I'm not like, oh, I wish I could have skipped that experience and gotten the same outcome. Right. So there, it's basically like time well spent. It's things you actually want to be doing, it's things you care about. And so this is what I experienced when I moved to Taiwan and I was doing nothing, didn't have any income coming in, and I was just writing every day. And I felt this sense of like connection, um, a sense of wholeness. And I was just like, I'm going to build my life around this. And I don't care if I go broke. And so that's what I really try to capture with what I'm talking about with good work. And yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, it's still early. I don't know if people will connect with it, but we'll see.
Now, because the book is largely framed around your experience, as you mentioned, kind of telling your story, um, one question that I had was, is good work mainly open to someone who has an elite education and credentials and can sort of do some, highly paid consulting work to free up a good section of their time? Or can you imagine, good work for someone who is a truck driver, a manufacturing foreman, a home health aide, someone who is working because they need to earn a living and don't have the luxury of, taking, a 3-month sabbatical to write?
Yeah. So, I mean, my good work is not paid that well. Um, I've been spending the majority of my time writing for 7.5 years and probably 2 more years before that.
Yeah.
If you count writing during work. If you break down like the earnings I've had from that work, it's probably less than 30 grand a year,
Mm-hmm.
but only because some of the sales in my first book. And so for me, I sort of decided that um, I had to do this. And my first few years, I didn't make more than 45 grand after I decided to commit to this work. All I did is basically lower my cost of living and decide that I was willing to make the trade-offs. We're still making trade-offs. We don't own a house. We don't really have a path to seeing ourselves owning a house in the US. We don't know if we can financially make it work living in the US long term. We might move abroad for lower cost of living. So me and my wife are like very aligned on the trade-offs and sacrifices we're making. We don't have like a plan to fund like a very fancy education for our kids. So we're basically just trying to figure it out as we go. Now, I did have some savings and a network of people to support me early on. And yeah, obviously there's some advantages there. I think what I would say is I'm not writing for everyone. I don't want to convince people, right? I'm trying to write for people like me that find these things and are like, oh my gosh, I want to point my life in this kind of direction. And through my community from the Pathless Path, like I've met hundreds of people from around the world, all material circumstances. I'd say generally they're not elite educated or high wage workers because those people doing what I'm doing is too painful. They'll say to me, how do I do what you're doing, but not sacrifice the private school house and like college education for my kids. And I'll say, I have no freaking idea.
Yeah.
Because like that path is the identity around the status and the continued achievement and continued work and success is like very hard to break out of. So yeah, like I wouldn't recommend it for high achievers who have an expensive life.
Yeah.
It's probably not for them, and there's probably reasons why they're on that. I think for me, I was always on that path, but I never really. I remember one time I made 6 figures for the first time in consulting. And I was like, man, this is crazy. It's like more money than you could ever need. This guy turns to me. He's like, you're out of your mind. He's like, you can't raise a family on anything less than 500 grand. It's like, what are you talking about? And like, I didn't realize how weird I was until I left that path. But yeah, like people's expectations are just really high on those paths. But that's not a normal thing worldwide.
What are some examples of, from your big community of people doing what they consider good work that is not writing? I'd love to hear some examples that are sort of not necessarily creative pursuits, but maybe people doing something else that they found that they would consider good work.
Yeah, I think it varies a lot. I would say, um, thinking of somebody that's taking care of a relative who's sick. And so they've downshifted work and are doing that in the prime of their career.
Hmm.
Um, and that is very meaningful. Another person is singing, and this is a guy in Greece. He sort of like gained encouragement from others to like put that out, and like he feels so good when he does it. And so he's trying to like share his music. Music is something that's very hard to make good money from,
Hmm.
right? And it's not about making money from the thing. It's about saying this is actually worth something worth prioritizing in your life. I think my shift was I always saw work as this thing like you had to do. And since I was on the wrong path, I was always trying to escape my circumstances, leave work early, job hop to different jobs, trying to find like the perfect job. Nothing ever felt quite right. But then with writing, it was like, oh, this is something I want to do. And again, over this last year, I basically have done nothing for the last 8 months except write and take care of my daughter because I watch her 2 to 3 days a week because my wife's working on a book now. And my income is basically steadily declined. And so for the last 4 months, I am spending more than I've brought in. And like sales of the first book have plummeted pretty dramatically over the past like 6 months. And I'm not like promoting it and I wasn't doing stuff, but I was having the time of my life. Like, because I know at the end of my life, if I can get like 5 to 10 of these experiences of like writing a book or doing similar things, I know I'm not going to be upset with how I spent that time. And that's basically the big bet is like, how do I spend my life where at the end of my life, I'm like, oh, that was nice.
Talk to us about, I want to go through some of the chapters in the book and
Yeah.
have you share a bit about uh, them. And I'll jump around a little bit. Um, let's talk about leave money on the table, chapter 12.
Yeah. So when I was employed, I always felt like I was like really good at leaving money on the table. I took a pay cut to get a job at McKinsey, going from GE. I left before I got paid bonuses 1 month before at one time. When I quit my final job, I had to write a check for a third of my savings, which was probably like 3 to 5 more months of living, much more if after I moved to Asia. Um, and then I quit my job and I didn't have anything lined up. And for the first 4 months, my savings just started shrinking and it felt terrible. It was like, what have I done? But as I started to make money and I also experienced more of those experiences over the first 3 to 4 years, I started just becoming more comfortable because I started to enjoy my life more. I was starting to get paid in different ways. I was paid in like basically I was laughing more. I was showing up more as a person I felt good about. I was really excited about projects I was working on. I started to attract good people into my life. And so I started to value a lot of these things. And a lot of people who are on unconventional or creative paths go through this shift of getting paid in visible rewards to getting paid in invisible rewards. And the biggest challenge with that is basically that means it's a loss of status. Now, some people see what I'm doing and find it really impressive. But for a good chunk of people, like even friends and family, like they sort of still see me as like somebody that's just like wasting my current path. Because I've made dramatically less than I would have if I just stayed. Like I literally could have just taken a strategy manager job somewhere, coasted, done the same kind of jobs, and pretty good at it. I'd probably have a couple million more dollars than I do now.
Mm.
But that seems incomprehensible to me based on like the satisfaction I've had with the journey over the last 7.5 years.
Yeah. I mean, something that, listeners to the show who are independent consultants have the opportunity to do, on this theme of leaving money on the table is, being very thoughtful about what projects you accept, right? So that's sort of, I think at some point you might be just taking any project that comes along, but in some cases there might be projects that, and I had a great conversation with Mary Kate Scott on the show, who kind of went through a set of, she has like this checklist. I don't think I can remember it exactly, but every project has to check at least 3 of the 5. And I think they were, is the topic, am I going to learn something? Do I really like the
Yeah.
people? Is it going to be a decent lifestyle? Am I going to make decent money? And, is it going to be something that could lead on to future work? Something like that, right? And you had to check at least 3 of those 5. And so even if something might be a well-compensated project, you might say, okay, it doesn't check the other ones. It's going to be miserable. I don't like the people. It's going to be traveling a lot. So, I've had some projects that I probably should have said no to.
Same.
And so those teach you to, leave money on the table and think about those invisible rewards.
Yeah, I think on this kind of path, if you like for independent freelancers, you inevitably will have to leave money on the table. Because if you're not actually going to sustain your journey. And what I mean by that is when you're working in a job, you can do work that you're like 4 out of 10 excited by because you're in the rhythm of a job. Everyone around you is doing similar things and you can sort of like keep going. Doing a 4 out of 10 project on your own and doing multiple of those in a row, you will be crushed. Often when you take these wrong projects, I've probably taken about 3 of them, you there's a recovery period. Like it's like whiplash after finishing them. You're like, oh, it's over. And then also you're starting to put in that gating criteria. So I have questions I go through now to sort of remind myself. I don't know if there's a way to fast track this other than taking these projects and learning the hard way. But yeah, I like to ask myself questions like, how much would I pay for this project?
Yeah.
Um,
Huh.
how excited am I on a scale of 1 to 10? If it's below an 8, it's a no, right? And what would I do with the money I'm getting from this project? Okay, I'd write more. Can I just do that now? And that's how I actually started my first book.
I want to just turn back to something you mentioned about the
Yeah,
status and how, you said that you kind of your status among certain populations would be like, he's kind of goofing off or whatever. He could be making more money. I find that so interesting because status uh, is so dependent on the um, on the audience, right? Or the subculture
right.
that you're talking about. Because I want to read some of these names that have been on your podcast. Um, so Kate Hall on Agency, Nate Eliason, Justin Welsh, Henry Oliver, Steve Schlafman, Justin Jackson, Packy McCormick, Tom Crislow, Luke Burgess, Anna Gatt, Kevin Kelly, Billy Oppenheimer, Tom Peters, Russ Roberts, Derek Silvers, David Perel, Venkatesh Rao, Kyla Scanlon. Those are so among certain populations,
Right.
uh, you know, being connected with those sorts of folks would be extremely high status. So,
Well, I didn't say I didn't have status.
yeah.
I'd say I lost a previous kind of status I had that came from having an impressive job and a high paycheck and an impressive career trajectory. This is sort of something I realized early on was that, okay, I still do crave appreciation, respect, admiration of others. I think we all desire this in some form.
Sure.
Um, and the way to hack that is to actually get admiration from people you actually value the admiration from,
Mm.
right? So, like for the most part, I'm okay with that loss of status. But it is real. There's a certain like the instant respect in people's eyes from like making a lot of money can or like being in an impressive job. Like for some people, that doesn't exist anymore, and I can see that. But it's fine because I want status for being creative, being experimental, being weird, like owning my path, like writing great sentences. If I can get status from those things, that's
Yeah.
great because those are things I actually want to continue to get better at, and I'm trying to do well.
Mhm.
So it's really about figuring out what prestige or status you actually want.
Yeah. But that's so interesting to me that you're saying you've lost status because I think it's so dependent on the audience. At least for me, someone who's had like a show with that list of guests, that to me is higher status than, being an associate partner at McKinsey, right? Like, and not having a show.
Yeah, do you think that's normal though? Like, I think most people probably still think like the average American is probably more impressed by the AP at McKinsey.
I don't know. I don't know. I guess it
I think so.
depends on.
I'm in like a bubble. We're probably both in a bubble. I have no idea.
Well, you're probably a bad audience to base your judgment on someone who hosts a podcast. But
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
but I mean, I don't know. Maybe I've always sort of thought like, having a community of thinkers and being a part of that and plugged into that, uh, to me is high status, and you are like exceptional in that area, right? So all these folks like being in swimming in that world and knowing those sorts of folks and being friends with those folks, to me that's, something that's super cool and sounds more fun than, being a partner at McKinsey who is anonymous to the wider world, right? Which,
Yeah, I agree. And this game fits me much better. And I
yeah,
think the great thing is like I love writing. I love creating. I love exploring ideas.
yeah.
And getting status from those people that also care about the same thing feels really good.
Hmm.
Now, when I was getting, like when I was working with CEOs in executive recruiting and doing CEO succession planning, like I sort of realized on the phone I was talking to these really impressive business types, and like I just like I'm like, I want to talk about books and ideas. Or like who's landing like, oh, this we just landed this $200,000 consulting project. I was like, it's like didn't move me. And it took me a while to realize there were other ways of setting up my life. And I think this is one of the great things about the internet is you don't have to go to academia or be in a PhD program to build an intellectual life. And I think 50 years ago, I probably would have ended up in academia
Mm.
because there wouldn't have been any other way I could like build a life around ideas and connecting with other similar people, who I think are still always going to be a minority of people.
Mm.
But there are these people that do crave an intellectual life and want that. And it's more possible than ever, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, over the past couple years, I've read two books on status. One was Status and Culture by I think it's David Marks. No relation to the other Marks. And then there's another book on status. I forget the title, but it's pretty good. And one question that uh, floating around is like, who are you seeking status from? It's really just a basic fundamental human need, right? It's almost
Yeah.
embarrassing to talk about though. It's like the first rule of status is you don't talk about status, but it's like you can't avoid it. It's after, food and drink and some shelter. That's what we crave. Being respected by other people in the tribe. It's like human inbound. But it gets to sort of like, what audience are you seeking status from? And depending on the audience, certain activities for some audience might be very high status, and for others they might just ignore it or think it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about these things. I think because, I mean, one of my ideas around work is that we're moving from this monoculture around work. There was this default path and it dominated our idea of how life should be spent. We've basically fractured into dozens of alternatives and we have no coherent narrative for them, right? But if you are going to like found a startup or become an independent contractor or work full time or be a part-time parent, like you need to figure out like who are the other people doing that?
Hmm.
What are you trying to get from it? How does it meet your needs? How does it meet your desires? And yeah, I think one of the challenges is that sometimes when people reposition their life, they might be getting status from like their parents or close friends on a way they're setting up their life. And they only realize that's gone once they move away from that. And so someone might love to get status from Will, who's like, oh, your cool ideas. I want to interview you in the podcast. But that same person may have lost status from their parents. Right. And it's hard to deal with. And the reality is like you have to make trade-offs and figure out what's worth optimizing for.
Talk to me about chapter 13, reclaim your ambition.
Yeah, so this is sort of the sub theme of the entire book. So I talked a bit about after I quit, I felt like I was sort of wasting my life. I sort of picture myself as this hack a living artist, just gonna write. I'm gonna make enough to get by, and I really didn't see myself as ambitious. I saw ambition as the path I left behind.
Hmm.
Um, Steady trajectory, moving up a career ladder. I had no one in my life that was an entrepreneur. No one in my life that was working independently or on their own. And so I really had to go find those people. But it took me a long time to like feel okay about this path. And it really wasn't until putting out the Pathless Path where I sort of had to let my heart into the book and say, hey, this matters. And as I'm finishing the book, I'm talking to my friend Chris on a video conference. He's like, dude, you're one of the most ambitious people I know. And I'm like, no. What are you talking about? I'm like, not making any money. I've been writing for years. I haven't made any money from writing. I am doing this book, but I'm like, I'm not ambitious. He's like, yeah, you are. You're like one of the only people I know that's like actually going after the life they want. And I'm like, dude, like we're gonna have kids. Like I have no plan to make money after next year. He's like, just accept it. And I didn't accept the compliment, but it like stirred in my head for the next year. And I moved to Austin after moving back to the US and I started meeting other people like me and hanging out with them and becoming friends with them. And I started feeling better about myself. And I remember one day I'm just like, I forget the exact day, but I'm like staring at myself as like, I'm ambitious. Like I felt so weird even saying ambitious out loud to myself. And then I said it louder again to myself. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to own this. I am ambitious about living a big life. Right. And yeah, it's something I think a lot about. I have taken care of my daughter 2 or 3 days a week since January, supporting my wife to finish her book and also stepping into the life I want, which is I want to be an active and present father. I also just want to have the experience of this. And that is the most ambitious thing I am called to right now. And it has been awesome. And it has directly led to my income declining, which is a problem I have to figure out. But like, I want to do this. I want to see this full out. I want to see where it goes. And I'm comfortable with this now. And I think a lot of what I was trying to do was set myself up to be an ambitious parent because that was always a dream of mine. Um, I was listening to Matthew McConaughey's Green Lights, and his number one goal was always like, I want to be a father. And I don't think I knew that until I met the right woman to marry. But yeah, I it's so clear now that I always wanted to be a father, and like this is the best thing in my life right now.
What do you think? Talk to me about the scripts that you had that was making you kind of turn away from this idea of being ambitious. Like, was there something that felt like inauthentic, or that you couldn't claim that title?
I think when I took the leap to independent freelancing, I never had the time like you did. I didn't have those 3, 4 years of wandering, being with myself. I'd never slowed down in my life. I didn't take vacation in between jobs, one job to the next. I never paused to reflect. And I think what I was doing was really just avoiding some of the discomfort of not being good enough, like actually having a face, like not feeling successful and all those things. And so I didn't have time to be with myself. And so I ended up on the path I was on, really avoiding my emotions. And as a way of avoiding those emotions, becoming tight, becoming rigid, becoming defiant too. And I was really burnt out and cynical when I left my full-time job. And I was angry about that. I didn't like that. I didn't feel good at the end of it. I felt defeated. I felt vanquished by my career. And I wanted to like burn it to the ground. Like, screw the corporate world. It did this to me. It broke me. It is so bad. Ambition is stupid. Success is stupid. All this stuff. And so this book is really about that journey of wanting to fight against the system, wanting to prove the corporate world is so terrible, but then discovering it had nothing to do with the corporate world. It had to do completely with me. I was in the wrong game, and I didn't know why I was doing any of it. And so a lot of the scripts were just my inability to see that there were other paths and other scripts and other ways of showing up where I didn't end up cynical. Um, but yeah, it's really my journey from wanting to escape work to actually finding work that I cared about.
Talk to me about side projects and how listener of the show could, use side projects to start testing and experimenting and exploring, to find their good work.
Yeah, so product market fit is when you have something that the market wants and wants to pay for. But person interest fit is also something worth optimizing for. It's proof that you're interested in something. So questions like, when's the last time you lost yourself in an experience when it felt so fun to create something? When is the last time like you were excited to wake up and start working on something? Right. Often in those moments, often they're parts of our jobs, parts of our freelance work. Often parts of those are clues that lead maybe not to something that can be paid for, but maybe something that can nourish our souls. Right. And I think that I have a hard time talking about this without invoking it, things like the soul, deeper connection. Um, I think these things matter to us, the human spirit. Like we need these sort of activities and actions that do nourish us. Um, and really, it's just about noticing them. Don't dismiss it because you don't know if you can make money from it. Take it seriously as a part of your life, right? And yeah, protect it and say, how can I fit this into my life? Right. And so I was indirectly doing this. I always wrote, like, I never realized writing could be something worth doing for work. until a year and a half after I quit my job. But looking back, it was always the thing I would be distracted on. Like when I was starting my freelance consulting, I like spun up a website. And then I spent about 300 hours writing this essay about my views on modern organizations. And I hired an editor to coach me on the writing. I paid somebody to create images for the essay. And like I just put the essay up and I was so happy. I didn't even send it to people. And looking back, it's like, oh, maybe there was a clue there. And like I wasn't even trying to find clients. And like this is the first like few months of after quitting my job, is spending all my time writing.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, it's really just noticing what are those activities that matter for you. And they can be anything. I think, I mean, judging from the outside, I sense you get a lot of joy from connecting people and how helping people find opportunities. I suspect that because like you have consistently done it for 12 years and it's hard to sustain anything or longer than that, I think, but it's hard to sustain things for more than a decade unless you actually really care about them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I also get a real kick out of creating content, creating, stuff that's useful for people, making things effectively. I like making physical things. My dad and I built a barn. We built a bunch of outbuildings and chicken coop and so forth. And making stuff online is fun too. It's satisfying to ship something. Um, and to your earlier point, like I think it's good if the side projects are not making any money. It's so helpful to do stuff, and some of it might just remain a side project or a hobby for a long time without the goal of it. But I think you should give yourself the permission to do side projects that maybe are different from a hobby, like a traditionally accepted
Yeah.
hobby, but are not intended to like make money, at least anywhere in the near term. They're just like experiments in making things and doing things or learning things.
Yeah, so when writing started to take over more of my life in the first year and a half after quitting my job, I kept letting it emerge more and more. I spent more time doing it. And I had this moment where I was like, oh shit, I'm screwed. Like, writing is awesome, and this is not a good way to make money.
Mm.
And in that same vein, I decided, okay, since a lot of writing activity is low paid, I'm not going to try to make money from it. Like I'm not going to try to get paid for freelancing. I'm not going to get paid for ghostwriting, which is a solid way to make money. Um, I'm not going to try to make money, but I was spending more than 50% of my time doing it. So I was like, okay, given this and that I'm going to do this no matter what, and it's going to take up the majority of my time and also leave open space so that I can be generative. I need to figure out a way to make money. And so after I committed to writing, I then created the course because the constraint I'd given myself is that I only want to make money in ways that are not tied to selling my time continuously. And I have had to break that. I've done a few freelance projects at moments of money scarcity. Um, but I can often like step away from writing for like a month or two, like create something, and that's fun for me. So I created the course. I've created 4 other courses that haven't really made money, but the consulting skills one did slowly over time. And as that started to make money, I also started dabbling with like these workshops I would run, and I'm still running them. I started offering them for like $3,000. Then I increased prices slowly. I built a very customized experience over time. And again, before I started this book, I did a workshop with a company. Actually, I did about 2 workshops. And that was like enough of a slight buffer to be like, okay, after this, I'm not taking any projects and I'm just going to write. And now I'm experimenting with trying to find somebody to run that. I don't know if I'll be able to make it profitable and make it work. I'm actually like spending a decent amount of money right now, which is another reason my income is declining. But I'm going to try to make that work as a funding vehicle so that I can go even deeper into writing. I want to publish like 10 books. And I need to build a life around that, which is a very challenging puzzle once you have kids.
Talk to me about something that you've learned about scripts from your podcast, which is, I think the full title of it is the Pathless Path podcast.
Yeah.
I got it right. Which, I mean, amazing set of guests. I listed just a few earlier. What have you learned about scripts from? I know, because I know you asked many of your guests that question.
Yeah, I think even for me, just noticing the wide range of scripts, the different language, the different expectations, whether people focus on outcomes, the journey, the emotions. I have one friend in Austin, and his parents told him his whole life, we want you to find joy through work. And that shocked me. I was like, what? I've never heard of such a thing. Like, I've never heard a parent say that. Like, I want to say these kind of things to my daughter. But for me growing up, it was like, well, you got to work. The most important thing in life is to get good grades so you can get a good job, right? Try to find a place where you can climb the ladder and get good benefits. Like, these are the kind of things I heard. And I just started imagining, it's like, what if somebody told me over and over again, you need to find joy through work, right? And the other interesting thing is a lot of people still have work challenges, right? So the people that are like, find joy through work, sometimes they're like, I wish my parents had pushed me harder to like follow the default path, right? So everyone has like things they wish they were told or weren't told. But most importantly, I think in adulthood, we can rewrite these scripts,
Yeah.
right? And when you're an independent consultant, many of you listening, there's no job promotion. So you have to come up with a replacement for that. You have to come up with a different way to judge your success. Like, the funny thing about this path is it's the most stable job period of my life on LinkedIn. 7.5 years, self-employed. I've done so many different things, but it's the most stable thing I've had. On my previous path, I was job hopping every 2 to 3 years, trying to like find the perfect fit. So you have to rewrite your scripts. I think any independent consultant needs to rewrite what success is. That's sort of unavoidable.
Yeah. Um, I feel kind of lucky actually with my parents because at a very stable home, right? My dad had a steady job. He worked for the same company for 28 years, and at next March will be 28 years since my dad left his job. He retired when he was 56, if you can believe
Wow.
that. So 28 years since he left his job, where only worked for 28 years. Only worked for 28 years in his life, if you don't count the 2 years in the army. But somehow I slipped through where it was like just perfect, where they didn't put any expectations on me, but gave me like a stable house. So there was, I got very little of that from my parents. Like, no, oh, you need to get a good job. I think I was just internally motivated to study. Like, I love school. So I think from sixth grade on, fifth grade, fourth grade, like they never asked me, have you done your homework? So I had very little expectations from my parents to do anything in particular. I went to the military. They're like, okay, that's fine. I left the military, take 4 years off. Yeah, okay, that's great. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Where did you get the idea to take time off after the military? Was that like a standard thing people did?
No. I two things. One is I book Walden. I was a big fan of, and I read like several times when I was in the Navy. And then there was this other book. I think it was called The Good Life or A Good Life. This couple, it was like written in the 30s, went and became farmers, and
Wow.
sort of self-sufficient farmers or something. And we had this property in Pennsylvania, our family farm, and I had spent all my summers there. So I said, okay, I'm just going to go back there and read all these books that I had wanted to read in college, and which I ended up doing. Read like all of Shakespeare, Thucydides, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Herodotus, all these books that I had never had time to read in college studying physics. And so, but my parents like never said that's a terrible idea. You know, I guess I was sort of lucky in my choice of parents that they didn't have any particular expectations for me. So I'm not sure if I could say like, oh, what scripts did your parents give you about work? I mean, seeing my dad, he had this,
Yeah.
steady job and paycheck and 9 to 5, but there was like no expectation that I follow that.
And it's hard. I mean, as a parent now, like you do want to give your kids guidance, but you don't want to like hold them back
Yeah, that's true.
from what they're meant to be doing. And we joke that our kids will almost certainly join the corporate world since Angie and I are both exiles of the corporate world.
Rebelling against. But I do have one final question. Having married Angie, who for a time, based on good work, I know worked as a personal trainer, has that
Yeah,
changed your own exercise routine? Are you?
probably. I think just for us, like fitness and strength and health is very important. I think even early on, after I quit my job, I realized, okay, I'm on my own. I don't have as good health care anymore. I need to take responsibility for this. And I think me becoming self-employed was a huge increase in self like reliance and just taking ownership of my life. I actually had a couple of years of chronic health issues, so I've always been very focused on my health ahead of other things. Because if I don't have my health, I can't do the things that matter to me. Um, so yeah, it's also great marrying a personal trainer. When we were living together the first year in Taiwan, I would just work out at her gym and she would train me every day. So yeah, that's amazing.
One way to get in shape. Um, all right, so let's bring it to a close. And why don't you tell us, Paul, where people can follow you? To mention your podcast, your website, where else people can stay in touch with what you're doing.
Yeah, so if people are interested in the book, you can go to pmillard.com. I link to both the Pathless Path and Good Work from there. Yeah, and I'm pretty easy to find. There's only one other Paul Millard, but he doesn't really have an online presence. So just Google my name and you'll find all my links.
All right, we will include those links in the show notes. Again, fabulous podcast. The book is Good Work, Reclaiming Your Inner Ambition. Paul, so great to catch up with you. And I'm so thrilled about how well your first book did and hope that the second one matches that. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you so much. And rooting for you too. I'm always inspired by your journey as well.